Tim and Kelly had a love story that began in high school. They were inseparable, spending time together whenever they could. Tim, a hard-working young man, often brought Kelly out to his family's farm, where they would enjoy the open land and each other's company. Their families believed they would eventually marry and spend their lives together. It seemed inevitable. They were a couple deeply in love, building a future together. On the evening of August 9th, 1980, Tim and Kelly attended a wedding reception at the Concord House, a banquet hall near an interstate in Wisconsin. They arrived around 10:30 p.m. and stayed for about 45 minutes. Witnesses recalled seeing Tim with a beer in hand, while Kelly had a soda. The couple seemed happy, enjoying their night before they were seen leaving the reception together. It was supposed to be a normal night, one of many they had spent together. But the next morning, everything changed. Tim's family expected him to be home early to help with farm chores, but when they woke up, he was nowhere to be found. Concern quickly set in. They reached out to Kelly's mother, hoping the couple had stayed at her house. When she said no, fear took over. Tim's family drove to the Concord house, hoping for answers. What they found instead was chilling. Tim's car was still parked outside. The driver's side door wasn't fully shut. His wallet was inside, untouched. There was no sign of Tim or Kelly. They had vanished. The search for the couple began immediately. Over the next 4 days, authorities interviewed employees of the Concord house and guests from the wedding reception. One recurring detail stood out. Multiple witnesses recalled seeing a dark, dirty van lurking in the parking lot. One person even mentioned that the van had sped off in a suspicious manner. Given the isolated nature of the Concord house, which was surrounded by a large, dimly lit parking lot and sat close to the interstate, the possibility of an abduction seemed more likely with every passing hour. Then a discovery was made. A teenage boy working on a tractor noticed something unusual near the road, a pair of women's pants. The pants were the same style Kelly had been wearing the night she disappeared, but they had been cut from the ankle up to the waist. Investigators immediately feared the worst. If the pants had been cut away while she was still wearing them, it likely meant a sexual assault had taken place. Over the next 10 days, more of Kelly's clothing was found, scattered within a 6-mile radius of the Concord house, along with several pieces of rope tied in various complex knots. The findings painted a grim picture of what had likely happened to the young couple. 10 days after Tim and Kelly disappeared, a group of squirrel hunters from Milwaukee stumbled upon a horrific scene in a wooded area about 7 miles from the Concord house. They found a badly decomposed body. 100 yards away, they found another. Tim was still fully clothed, wearing the same outfit he had on the night of August 9th. Kelly's body showed signs of strangulation, with damage and insect activity concentrated around her throat. Tim had suffered multiple stab wounds. The nightmare was confirmed. Tim and Kelly had been murdered. Investigators focused on the pieces of rope found near the crime scenes. The knots were not ones an average person would tie. They included square knots, half hitches, clove hitches, and bowline knots, techniques commonly used by those with military or trade experience, such as carpenters and painters. Despite this clue, the case remained unsolved for over 2 decades. For the Hack family, life was never the same. They had to move forward without their oldest son. The pain of losing him, combined with the uncertainty of who had done it, weighed heavily on them. Years passed, but the case grew colder. Then, in the early 2000s, advances in DNA technology brought new hope. Investigators tested seminal fluid found on Kelly's pants and underwear, hoping for a match. Meanwhile, a breakthrough came in the form of a phone call. A woman named April reached out to the police. She told them she believed her father, Edward Wayne Edwards, was responsible for Tim and Kelly's murder. She directed authorities to a book he had written about his life as a career criminal. Edwards was no ordinary suspect. He had once been on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list and had even appeared on talk shows discussing his past crimes. Investigators discovered that Edwards had a history of violence and had been a suspect in a double homicide in Portland, Oregon, in the late 1960s. He was controlling, manipulative, and enjoyed inserting himself into public life under the guise of a reformed criminal. Even more concerning, he had a background in the military and knew how to tie complex knots, the very ones found near Kelly's body. Authorities learned that Edwards had lived near the crime scene in 1980, but had moved out of state shortly after Tim and Kelly's murders. When he was first interviewed by police in September 1980, he had a broken nose. He claimed he had injured himself in a hunting accident, but investigators found the explanation suspicious. In Wisconsin, deer hunting season occurs in November, not August. The pieces were coming together. Further investigation revealed that Edwards owned a van, matching the description of the suspicious vehicle seen in the Concord House parking lot. He also kept a .357 revolver in the van. It all fit. Authorities believed that on the night of August 9, 1980, Edwards had been lying in wait outside the Concord house. Kelly was exactly the type of victim he sought. When the couple reached Tim's car, Edwards made his move. Tim, a strong farm boy, likely fought back, landing a solid punch that broke Edwards' nose. That's when Edwards retaliated, stabbing Tim to death before abducting Kelly. She was raped, strangled, and dumped in the woods. After nearly 30 years, police confronted Edwards. By this time, he was an old man, overweight, on oxygen, and confined to a wheelchair. Yet, his arrogance remained. He acted as if their visit was insignificant, as if he had already won. When asked for a DNA sample, he agreed, believing they wouldn't have any solid evidence. He was wrong. The DNA was a perfect match. During his interrogation, Edwards initially denied any involvement. But as the pressure mounted, he made a quiet, chilling admission, muttering under his breath, "Damn it, I killed her." It was undeniable. The man responsible for the brutal murders of Tim and Kelly had been caught. Ultimately, Edwards pleaded guilty. But Tim and Kelly weren't his only victims. He also confessed to murdering his foster son, Danny. Some even believe he was the infamous Zodiac killer due to his history of targeting couples, his drifting lifestyle, and eerie coincidences in his name's letter count matching Zodiac ciphers. Edwards was sentenced to life in prison. He was sent to the Ohio Corrections Medical Center, where he died in 2011. His capture brought a sense of relief to the families of Tim and Kelly, but it could never bring back what they had lost. Their children had been stolen from them in an act of pure evil. For the Hack and Drew families, justice came late, but it came nonetheless. They finally knew the truth. Tim and Kelly's story had been one of young love, of a future that should have been. But in the end, it became a case of tragedy and perseverance, of a family's long fight for answers, and of a killer who, despite his belief that he had outsmarted everyone, was finally caught.
Greg Kelly had the kind of future that made people around him feel proud just to know him. A standout high school football star in Leander, Texas, Greg was fast, focused, and determined. Everything a young athlete needed to climb to a Division I scholarship. Coaches praised his work ethic, teachers respected his discipline, and classmates admired his kindness and drive. At home, he was the pride of his family, grounded, polite, and always willing to lend a hand. Greg wasn't just talented, he was, by all accounts, a good kid. In the summer of 2013, Greg's life was all about workouts, preparation, and staying on the straight path to college ball. He stayed temporarily with a friend whose family ran an in-home daycare. He was never involved in the daycare himself, he was just crashing there, a safe place to sleep. It seemed like a simple arrangement until it wasn't. In August 2013, the unthinkable happened. Greg was accused of sexually assaulting a 4-year-old boy who had been attending that same daycare. The accusation hit like a bomb. Greg was arrested and the case moved fast. Too fast. There was no physical evidence, no proper forensic interviews, and no time to question the logic behind how someone with Greg's airtight schedule could have committed the crime. Still, the case went to trial in 2014, and the verdict was a gut punch: guilty. The sentence? 25 years in prison, no parole. In court, Greg's family sat stunned. His mother, Rosa Kelly, didn't just cry, she collapsed emotionally. Her son, who she knew in her bones was innocent, was being taken from her. She sold her home to fund his legal fight, watched as her son was hauled off to prison, and refused to let him be forgotten. Greg, meanwhile, sat in a prison cell knowing the truth and waiting for someone, anyone, to listen. He wasn't alone. A growing group of supporters, family, friends, classmates, and strangers started asking questions. Why had the investigation ignored another possible suspect? Why was there no DNA evidence? Why did the lead detective not follow up on glaring inconsistencies? As doubts grew louder, so did Greg's supporters. They were convinced he was the victim of a rush to judgment, and they weren't letting it go. Years passed. Then, in 2017, the tide began to turn. A new district attorney reopened the case. Investigators finally looked into another man who had access to the children at the daycare, someone with a troubling past. As the evidence was re-examined, the original investigation was exposed for what it was: flawed, incomplete, and biased. In 2019, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled to overturn Greg's conviction. The moment was explosive. Greg was officially exonerated. He walked out of that courtroom with no chains, no record, and a name finally cleared. The nightmare had lasted 6 long years, 3 of them behind bars, but justice, though delayed, had arrived. Greg didn't waste time playing the victim. He got back to football, earning a scholarship to Eastern Michigan University. He launched a nonprofit to support others wrongly accused. He rebuilt his life from ashes, brick by brick. His story reached millions through the documentary series Outcry, which laid bare the broken system that had nearly destroyed him. His family, once broken by the injustice, stood tall beside him. Rosa had her son back, Greg's supporters had their proof, and Texas had a lot of hard questions to answer. Greg Kelly's story isn't just about what happened to him. It's about what can happen to anyone when a justice system forgets its duty to be fair. Gary Parks didn't hesitate when the call came in. It was February 16, 1987, and a fire had broken out at the Everett Community College Library in Everett, Washington. Gary, a decorated firefighter and father of 2, rushed into the blaze like he always did, with courage, heart, and zero concern for his safety. But this fire wasn't like the others. It was intense, fast-moving, designed to kill. Gary never made it out. The building collapsed on him. The city lost one of its bravest, and his family lost the man who kissed them goodbye every morning and promised to come home. For years, Everett mourned. The fire was ruled arson, but no one knew who was behind it. Tips went nowhere. Evidence was thin. The case froze over. For 30 years, Gary's family lived with that silence. His children grew up without him. His widow attended firefighter memorials year after year, waiting for news. And the city of Everett kept his memory alive with plaques, dedications, and questions that never got answers. Then, in 2017, something incredible happened. Elmer Nash, a 42-year-old man in Oregon, walked into a therapist's office and confessed. He said he'd started the fire when he was just 12 years old. It wasn't some calculated act, it was a thrill, a moment of rebellion that spiraled into death. He had no idea a firefighter had died that day. But once he learned the truth, he said the guilt had eaten at him every day since. The therapist, stunned, reported the confession. Investigators reopened the cold case. They verified Nash's details, matched timelines, and checked facts. It all lined up. In 2021, Elmer Nash was formally charged with first-degree murder and arson. His past had finally caught up with him. In court, Nash pled guilty. He stood there, a grown man haunted by a crime he committed as a child, and took full responsibility. The judge faced a moral maze. Elmer had been 12 when it happened. He'd kept the secret for decades, but he'd also taken a life. In May 2021, Nash was sentenced to 10 years in prison and lifetime supervision after release. The sentence sparked mixed emotions. Gary Parks's family felt a deep sense of closure. His daughter said it best. "It doesn't bring my dad back, but at least we know the truth now." For decades they had grieved without answers. Now, they had a name, a face, and a confession. That counted for something. Nash's own family, blindsided by the revelation, struggled with the news. They had known him as a quiet, hard-working man. They never suspected he had once caused such destruction. Some supported him. Others distanced themselves. But the story didn't end with anger. It ended with reflection on how one mistake, no matter how long ago, can ripple through generations. Today, Elmer Nash is serving his sentence at a correctional facility in Washington. Gary Parks is honored every year in Everett with memorial runs and scholarships in his name. His legacy lives on, not in the fire that took him, but in the courage he showed in running into it. Greg Kelly and Elmer Nash are on opposite ends of justice. One was innocent, fighting to reclaim his name. The other was guilty, haunted by a secret for decades. But both stories speak to the power of truth, how it can be buried, twisted, or delayed, but not erased. In Greg's case, justice failed first and corrected itself later. In Elmer's, justice was delayed, but not denied. And in both cases, families lived with pain that never completely fades, but finally has a name to attach to it, whether it's a criminal exonerated or a guilty man finally brought to light. Because in the end, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about answers. It's about facing the truth, however hard it is, and refusing to let it stay in the dark. On Memorial Day weekend in 1984, Brigham City, Utah was quiet, wrapped in the stillness of the early hours before dawn. Two college students, Sabah and Barish, had spent the entire night buried in their books, preparing for a critical final exam. Fatigue had settled in, and the weight of their studies had them yearning for a break. As the night stretched on, they made a spontaneous decision to put the books aside, take a drive, and grab some breakfast. It was a simple plan, an ordinary outing, but neither knew they were about to stumble into something far darker than they could have imagined. At approximately 3:50 a.m., their car rolled into a dimly lit gas station, the kind that seemed deserted at such an hour. Pulling up to a self-service pump, they expected to fuel up, pay, and leave. But what happened next struck them as odd. Instead of pumping their gas, a man emerged from the store and insisted on serving them. In an era when gas stations were transitioning to self-service, the offer was unexpected. Even more unsettling was the fact that this attendant, whoever he was, instructed them not to enter the store. He asked what they needed, took their money, a $5 bill for gas and another for cigarettes, and disappeared inside the building. When he returned, he handed over the cigarettes and some change, but something wasn't right. The cigarettes cost exactly $1, and as the student took the 4 returned bills, he noticed something horrifying. Blood. Wet, dark, and fresh, smeared on the man's hands. Panic surged through them. An unshakable feeling told them they needed to leave. Immediately. Without hesitation, they drove off, the weight of an unspoken terror pressing against them. 5 or 6 miles down the road, their fear turned into action. They stopped at the nearest phone booth and called the police. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived at the gas station. What they found was a gruesome, unimaginable crime scene. Inside the store, a man lay lifeless in a pool of blood, his body twisted in death, his hands bound behind his back with wire. His injuries told the story of sheer brutality. He had been stabbed through the chest with a foot-long screwdriver. A cast-iron bell had been used to strike his skull, fracturing it. But the final devastating blow came from a heavy soda canister, nearly 40 pounds, which had been used to crush his head. The victim was Brad Perry, a familiar face to the officers and a friend to many in Brigham City. Perry had worked at the gas station for years, known for his friendly demeanor and easygoing nature. He was young, with his whole life ahead of him, and now, in a senseless act of violence, he was gone. The town reeled in shock and grief. Saba and Barish, the two students, were immediately brought in for questioning. They had been the last known witnesses to see anyone at the gas station, aside from Perry. With the help of a police sketch artist, they attempted to recreate the face of the attendant who had served them, but frustration mounted. The sketch artist struggled to capture what Saba had seen so vividly in his mind. Finally, taking matters into his own hands, Saba, an adept artist himself, sketched the man's face. The drawing was chilling. The students had both recalled something eerie about his eyes, empty, soulless, and deeply unsettling. That evening, officers patrolling Highway 89 noticed a man walking southbound. He matched the description the students had provided. His clothes were stained with blood, his hands still bearing the evidence of something violent. His name was Mr. Ellsworth. The police believed they had their suspect, but when Saba and Barish were called in to identify him, they both shook their heads. This wasn't the man they had seen at the gas station. The investigation hit a dead end. Evidence was scarce. No direct leads pointed to anyone specific. The case, despite rigorous efforts, went cold. Years passed. The Perry family lived in agony, haunted by unanswered questions and unfulfilled justice. But hope arrived in the form of Amy, a determined investigator who refused to let the case be forgotten. She pored over old evidence, questioning what had and hadn't been tested with modern forensic methods. When she asked if the existing evidence had been tested for DNA, the answer was no. At the time of the murder, DNA testing was in its infancy, used sparingly, and often requiring large samples to yield results. But Amy wasn't willing to accept that limitation. She fought for additional funding, convinced that something, anything, might lead them to the killer. The evidence was tested, and the results came back. The blood found at the crime scene belonged to Brad Perry. It was a disappointment, a devastating setback. There was still nothing to point to the murderer. But then, Amy remembered one overlooked piece of evidence, the blood-stained dollar bill handed to Saba at the gas station. It had been stored away, untouched for decades. When it was finally tested, the results sent shockwaves through the investigation. The DNA was a match. The blood didn't belong to Perry. It belonged to Glenn Griffin. Glenn Griffin was a career criminal, in and out of prison for most of his life. At the time of the discovery, he was already serving time in a federal prison in Lompoc, California, for operating a clandestine meth lab. Amy and the team immediately began researching his background, tracing his connections. One name kept surfacing, Wade Monday. The two were inseparable back in 1984. When confronted, Wade Mon hesitated, but ultimately, he couldn't deny the truth. He had been there that night. It all started with an argument over beer and a dispute about change. Glenn Griffin lost control. He attacked Brad Perry, and as things escalated, Wade admitted, "All I did was help tie him up and keep him down." But that admission, in itself, was damning. Wade had been an accomplice in a brutal murder. Even with his confession, Wade refused to testify against Glenn Griffin. Despite being granted immunity, he remained silent in court. But the DNA evidence, combined with the sketches and the witnesses' accounts, was overwhelming. Glenn Griffin was finally convicted of the murder of Brad Perry, nearly 2 decades after the crime. He was sentenced to life in prison. Wade Mon, despite his involvement, was found not guilty by the jury, a decision that left many, including the investigators, frustrated. For the Perry family, justice had been a long time coming. Their pain never faded. But knowing Brad's killer was finally behind bars offered a small measure of peace. Glenn Griffin had spent years thinking he had escaped justice, but in the end, a single dollar bill, one stained with blood and forgotten for decades, had brought the truth to light. Brad Perry's story, once a cold case, became a testament to persistence, forensic advancements, and the power of determined individuals who refused to let justice slip away.